Croeso pawb, as we say back home in Wales. So first, can I thank you all for joining on what is probably one of the hottest days of the year at the end of term as well, so I really do appreciate it. I hope I can make this a useful piece of time for you as well. I'm going to talk through today the research that I've been engaged in for the last probably 10 to 15 years now. I'm going to kick off with a very short intro film about what I'm doing, which was filmed in Colombia. Then I'll talk specifically about the research, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the new research centre for culture, conflict and creativity that we're taking place at UCA, where, as Emma said, I'm Assistant Deputy Vice Chancellor, working mainly with Professor Catherine Harper, who is also joining us today, so welcome, Catherine. There will then be some space for some questions. It's a lot to get into a very short period of time. I will put my email up at the end if people have any other questions they'd like to follow up, if they want to follow up on any references, or if they wanted any clarity, or if they want to get involved, or if they want to pass this information to anybody else. So without further ado, I shall move to the area that I've been working in for quite a long time. This is a quote from the famous German book, The Never-Ending Story. And it talks about the area that I'm really interested in, which is about ideas and how they can be manipulated and how they can make us think different things. And I'm interested about how culture, art, creativity plays a role in that manipulation sometimes as well, or changing in a positive way sometimes. This is about how people can manipulate ideas and power and the role that art and culture can have in that as well. And that's at the centre of my research work. It's about what we call imaginaries, these shared ideas and beliefs. And an example of an imaginary would be an imaginary of what it means to be Welsh, an imaginary of what it means to be Irish, an imaginary of what it means to be in a certain community somewhere, how we construct these social ideas. My background is in, I suppose, theoretical sociology and psychology mainly, but I've worked for a long time also within the art sector, and I'm trying to bring those two areas together. So I'll just play a very short film. It's only 3 minutes. Enjoy.
Los jóvenes juegan un papel activo en la construcción de sociedades civiles inclusivas. A través del arte promueven el cambio. Se convierten en las voces que le dan vida a una fotografía, que derraman sentimientos, que le cantan a la paz y que celebran la vida. Son las voces que hablan de inclusión y de reparación, que discuten y reflexionan sobre y por sus derechos. Los jóvenes son las voces del territorio.
I've been coming here for about 20 years. I'm interested in how the role of culture in changing people's imaginaries, their ideas of how the world works, to challenge ideas around violence and how you can use culture to actually, in a positive way, reconstruct people's ideas. So I've been interviewing people, artists, people working in NGOs, people who work in government, about their values, about how they construct their imaginaries, and what they think the role of culture is. And the purpose of doing this is to try and look at what are the dominant narratives and then how you can challenge and change them. When you're working within a big global system of structured inequality, to construct these challenging cultural programs within this big global system and within Colombia itself, unfortunately, is really difficult because they often get neutralized. They get neutralized by capital, neutralized by business, neutralized by the fact that you're still in complete poverty. How do you enact social transformation in somewhere like Colombia? And for me, it's about a communitarian approach where you bring different organizations together, share best practice, share experience. I'm interested in how culture can do that, but also organizations that then work with culture, how we can share that information to create something that is bigger. It's really about how you can then change policy. So that gives you an idea of the area I'm working in. I'm going to talk today mainly about Colombia, and that's mainly because of time as well. Most of my work is taking place in Colombia and Brazil, but also a lot of work is taking place in places like Bolivia and Venezuela as well. But today I'm going to concentrate on Colombia, and a lot of the images I'm going to show you are, they're kind of random images in a way, but I wanted you to get a flavour about Colombia, and I'll talk a little bit more about Colombia later on. These are different photos taken at different times over the last 20 years of street graffiti, theatre performances, just to give you the kind of dynamic flavour that Colombia has, which is quite a unique place. So I've talked about culture and the imaginary, and this really is a way to try and explore issues around power, which I'm particularly interested in, about whose ideas come to dominate and how we think about the world with those ideas dominating as well. But also these dominant ideas like violence, for example, or neoliberalism, how they can be challenged and how art, particularly in the practice of art, can have a role in doing that. The people often say to me, okay, you're coming at this from a social science perspective, and I am, but I'm also coming at it from an artist perspective and trying to marry those two different areas together. All of these pictures are all mine, by the way. They're just to different places within Colombia to give a sense of the dynamics that you get in this country. Quite astonishing beauty, but also incredible violence. So a large part of my recent research was with an AHRC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, Changing the Story project. This was a huge global project looking at all of the countries that are listed on there. I was the principal investigator for Colombia. And really, I think this project was looking at a comparative different approaches, everything from ethnography through to social psychology, different ways of exploring the area of art, culture and violence as well. I'm going to talk you through a little bit what I did with my research and what I found. Just for those of you who are not from a social science background, a quick glossary. An imaginary, I've used this a lot, and it's about shared ideas and values. As I said, the classic one would be what it means to be Welsh, which is lots of different things. By hegemony, I'm talking about the ideas of Gramsci here, about things that come to dominate and things that can be challenging domination as well. The cultural field you'll see me mention later on, and this is about this network of social relations, structured systems. This could easily be the political field, it could be the religious field. It's a grouping of relations struck together. By neoliberalism here, I'm talking about the real hardcore economic liberalism and free market approach to capitalism. And then finally, a word that is used a lot, particularly in Latin America, because Latin America has a huge, I suppose, what was called the pink tide, a left-wing challenge to dominant political ideas like neoliberalism, and that's called communitarianism. It's about moving away from the Thatcherite, there is no society, it's just individuals, to this community-based approach. And I found as a young musician when I first went to Colombia, not as a social scientist, that's what drew me, was that left-wing radical politics, something in Colombia that I didn't see happening elsewhere. So what did I do? Before I started my research, I worked quite a lot on developing a theoretical framework, and I've just talked about some of those key areas. So I developed a framework that brought in these different ideas about how people structure reality. The cultural field I've talked about, imaginaries I've talked about, hegemonies I've talked about. Hybridity really comes from the Argentinian social scientist Canclini, and this is the idea of how things are constantly in flux and constantly changing. You can't just nail something down once and for all. So when we're talking about culture in London, or culture in Bogota, or culture in Rio, it's never static. It changes, it moves. And even if you take something, for example, like McDonald's, and drop this very, I suppose, dominant approach to a certain kind of cultural area, it changes within the place that it's actually in. So you may think McDonald's is the same wherever you want into, but it isn't. It'll change and become hybridized. And this is also what happens to other forms of culture as well, and other forms of art. So what I developed, and you'll see some of this is in Spanish, it's deliberately in Spanish because I work a lot in Spanish, so I thought it'd be nice to share that with you. There are other languages apart from English. And this is what I developed, this theatrical model called the quadruple helix. It's about how these different areas all intertwine with each other. And I use this as a way of examining the research that I did, examining the interviews that I was doing, examining the policy documents I was reading. So for me, it was just a number of different lenses coming together. So what did I find? So a little bit here about Colombia as I come into it. This is one of my favorite ever pieces of street art. It's from the home of Shakira in Barranquilla in northern Colombia, and it roughly translates. There've been loads of death squads in the area, and people put this fantastic poster up which says basically, they tried to bury us, they didn't realize we were seeds. And I think this for me helps sum up that challenge to extreme situations in Colombia and how art can be used as a form of challenge as well and a form of hope. So Colombia, this is a picture of Bogota at night. What can I say about Colombia? I'll tell you a joke about Colombia. I was very lucky to interview a lot of people for my research. One of them was the very first culture minister of Colombia, and he told me about an argument he had with Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who was very prominent in Colombia in the 1990s when this took place. And they were trying to decide whether they should have any cultural policy at all. Gabriel was not in favor of any cultural policy. But he said, you always have to remember something about Colombia. And it's trying to explain Colombia to people that don't know it. I'll tell you one thing, and that will be a joke, which says more about Colombia than anything else. When God created Colombia, he made it the most beautiful place in the world. It has oceans, it has mountains, it has vegetables, flowers, diamonds, rubies, animals of all types. It is the most exquisite place. And other people in other countries complained to God and said, this isn't fair. So God thought for a moment and then said, I know, I shall speak to my friend Satan. And he spoke to Satan and said, Satan, I need you to do something for me. And forevermore, Satan was in charge of picking all of the leaders and all of the politicians for Colombia for the rest of time. And this theme of Colombia, of violence, threads through its history from when it became independent in the early 1800s under Simon Bolivar. The conflict there is complicated. I am no way going to try and summarize it in the time that we have, but just to say it's about land dispute, it's about culture, it's about language, it's about lots of different things. It's very difficult to unpick, but it's been going not just since the 1948 uprising, which a lot of people will talk about when this huge current upsurge of violence began, but since the 1800s. And as you can see in these figures, lots of people have died. It's been a huge displacement of populations. If you go to Bogota, or if you go to Cali or the Medellin, any of those places, you will see often these barrios, or what they call in Brazil favelas, springing up where people have been shifted off their land. Peasants have been moved up by paramilitaries, counter-paramilitaries as well. It's incredibly messy, incredibly complex situation. So I'm interviewing people who've been involved in these situations. They're involved in culture. They range from culture ministers to activists. The approach I took, as I said, was using this theoretical modeling, but also reviewing a lot of documents about cultural policy, a lot of documents around, for example, the constitution in Colombia, and then key interventions that people were making to see what were they doing about this, what worked, what didn't work. And these are some of the things that my research threw up. As I've said, violence permeates the whole of Colombia in a way that I've not seen in other places for the past 200 years, basically. And it's this central idea of violence that is throughout the whole of the country and affects the shaping of culture in Colombia as well. And this field of violence, if I'm using the Bourdieusian term, permeates all aspects of life. Alongside this, Colombia chose a very, very far right, I suppose, approach to its economic development and really set its eyes on the USA as a model. And so alongside this violence, you have this neoliberalist dominance as well. And when I'm talking about a global North dominance here, I'm talking about this idea of the dominance of Western institutions and Western neoliberalism as well. Neo-colonial structures, key international institutions like the World Bank as well. And most interestingly, so this is where I first started to come across this real pushback against the idea of creative economy that so many people in Britain love. Most of the activists I interviewed found this an anathema to cultural life, and the concept of the creative economy itself was seen as this concept drawn up by this dominant Western neoliberalist model as well. It's all about the money. I think also the interesting thing that came out was when you did start to look at people challenging these models as well, it was very difficult to get traction with sometimes large-scale policies within a global neoliberalist system. So even in somewhere, and I'll skip briefly to Brazil, for example, where there was this program called Pontos da Cultura. It spent millions and millions upon taking money out, away from traditional arts councils and giving it directly to people in what in Latin America is called the periphery, people from poor economic backgrounds, from Black Caribbean backgrounds, from indigenous backgrounds. And this was an amazing program that ran under Gilberto Gil, the Brazilian musician. it just died basically because there was so many different people from so many different areas trying to close the idea down, whether it was about intellectual property, whether it was about accountancy and how you measured things and impact as well. And similar in Colombia, it's about anything radical often gets neutralized. And I'm interested in this idea from Gramsci, how alternative ideas get neutralized by the state, particularly around the neoliberal state as well. So you have these two things coming together here in terms of cultural discourse: extreme violence and neoliberalization, and they collide. You have extreme poverty, the state steps back. If we think Boris is potentially pulling back the state now, wait till you see what's happening in Colombia. And I think it's a really interesting picture that you're left with, is this kind of extreme wealth concentrated in the hands of what were originally Spanish landowners that passed the money down through their families over the last 200 to 300 years, and very impoverished people as well. But then, what is the role of culture then in challenging this huge model? Finally, on this bit about key themes, if you've ever been to Colombia or seen pictures of Colombia as well, it can be quite terrifying in some places in terms of what's called gangster culture in Colombia as well. I love this capitalism and steroids approach as well, which really kind of sums up this hyper-sexualized culture as well. And a lot of people I interviewed said it was really problematic to try and deal with, I suppose, particularly hip-hop, which is a very potent art form within Colombia as well, and these over-sexualized, these quite violent portrayals of life as well. And I think you can see the antecedents to this in terms of the neoliberal shaping, the looking towards the United States as a model for the country, and the extreme violence as well, which permeates all life. So, what do people try and do about this if you're living there? How do you fight back to a certain extent against these dominant imaginaries around neoliberalism, around power, around violence, around hypersexuality? And I think it's about transforming the imaginary, and I interviewed a number of people who were approached in that way. And I'm going to be quoting a lot of people directly here, so I thought it'd be quite nice for you to hear other people's voices and not mine as well. One of the key areas was about trying that emerged in my research was about this communitarian approach, the approach of working together, this approach of looking at other ways of understanding the world, particularly in Colombia around indigenous populations. There is another way of knowing. There is another world that we can explore, this global south epistemological stance that we can look at as well, and what we can learn from that, and trying to move away from that neo-colonial arrogance that we have all of the answers. This is from a small group working with classical music across some of the very peripheral areas in the Amazonas, working a lot with indigenous groups as well, and looking at how the indigenous world looks at culture in a different way, and not be afraid to look at utopias and look at these ideas of how we can redefine identity within Colombia using culture, using dance, using music, using narrative storylines, and using text, everything. And it's about trying to move the conversation away from these areas that things cannot be changed as well. I love this one particularly. This is from a radical dance group in Cartagena, which is one of the oldest colonial cities, right in the sort of Caribbean top north of Colombia as well. And these are the young people that are working with. This is a picture I took of a performance that they did. They were street kids that they brought on and trained up and worked with using dance as a way. And it's just, art is an anti-bulletproof vest. It's amazing. It's what inspired me when I came to Colombia, about this passion for art, about how art can be central to the discourse that you can have in civic life. And we have a place, and we can argue for different ways of looking at the world as well. I think it's quite beautiful. This is, central to a lot of my research as well, is to talk about how culture can actually redefine things. It's about how it can challenge the logic of violence as well. And I can remember interviewing people around circus where they talked about they were training young people of a lot of paramilitary groups, and they would leave the circus alone because they were looking after their kids, and they would let them exist within this very violent area that they were in. but they could then gradually use their circus, and circus is quite a radical art form in Latin America, to once again challenge these dominant logics, these dominant imaginaries within everybody's life as well. I'm trying to kind of summarize some here, and I think what I found really was that there was a passion for this other way of looking at the world, what I'm calling a counter-hegemonic imaginary, this global south way of looking at decolonized, moving away from this idea of neoliberalist power as well, and looking at communitarian and indigenous ideas and shaping alternative approaches, challenging those narratives, challenging the orthodoxy around violence, hypersexuality, around many is God. And I think this model here is just a way about how you can try, and what people, very many activists are trying to do, is bring these peripheral imaginary. Once again, peripheral in this sense means those who are excluded on the outside. And this can be everything from LGBTQ to indigenous, and it's about those who don't have a voice, and try and bring them into this new cultural conversation and change the power situation. It's a radicalism and thinking about things in a different way. In a depressing way, a lot of this stuff gets crushed because of the way that hegemony works. Dominant ideas, instead of often pushing away these counter-hegemonies, say, great, yeah, of course, come with us. We really care about all the indigenous people, or we're really, really body positive, or we're really, whatever it is. You see it in Western life as well, about you don't directly push away a challenge, you neutralize it by accepting it and then neutralizing it once it's within. And that's true of policy, it's true of culture, it's just as true within England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland as it is within Brazil and Colombia. But also, I think it's about seeing the role of art and culture and helping change our national imaginaries about who we are and how we can do things differently. We don't have to accept the status quo. We can start to challenge those ideas of violence, and it's always been like this and we can't do anything about it. Art, as a lot of the people I've interviewed said, can be a way of making a difference. And this is my final slide, and this is really on, this is a woman I interviewed in Medellin, and she ran the Museum of Memories, which is quite a very difficult place to walk through. But she is now on the reconciliation group in Colombia as well. And this is her saying that we need to understand that art is the most powerful method for making a transformation of our life. And I mean that in not just in the broad sense of art and culture and the way that we live, but even the narrower sense about how we make things and how we express ourselves, and how art can have that capacity to tell us different stories. And I think this is a beautiful quote. You know, she challenges the FARC and the ELN, which is not an easy thing to be doing. It's not an easy thing to be challenging the paramilitaries. Those of you who've worked in this area will know. But in summary, art can make a difference to the way we think about the world. There is an opportunity to challenge dominant orthodoxies. We don't have to accept the way that we are. And for me, other parts of the world can help us learn something about ourselves, and that we can hopefully apply also to where we live and the situations that we and others are in. So I think that is the finish of that presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit quickly before I take questions about how this work, alongside the work of people like Professor Catherine Harper, who's here today as well, will be coming into a new centre that we're establishing at UCA around culture, conflict and creativity. I've got a little bit here where it's about conflict in its broader sense. We talk about all kinds of conflict, not just about armed conflict as well. And we're talking about artistic practice, something that the University of the Creative Arts has expertise in. It is about the practice that we have and how we can apply that in a research context into some of these areas of conflict. And we're launching the centre later this year. I'm very excited about it. There'll be a big conference in October. We'll keep all the emails and send you information around all of it. You can put this in there, keep your date, one-day conference. It'll be in Canterbury, but also online for those of you that are interested. We have lots of great speakers talking about lots of different things. You don't just have to listen to me banging on in my Barry accent. You can listen to others talking from around the world as well. I think that's probably my time up, pretty much. I've done it within 4 minutes to spare. Thank you very much for taking the time today on what is an incredibly hot day and the end one. I hope I didn't bore you too much and it was interesting. If you want any further information, here's my email address to contact me as well. And I'll hand over to Amma now if anybody has any questions.
Thank you, Simon. Very interesting presentation, and we're looking forward to see the activities of the new research center. We have a raised hand from Catherine. Catherine, if you want to share your thoughts.
Yes, absolutely. Can I just first of all say thank you for a really, really powerful, really moving testimony. And I've sort of been live tweeting as I've been listening, just some random thoughts about the political power that you've actually articulated, Simon, but in a very sort of gentle way, which I think is the alternative way forward, the persistence of that quiet but powerful voice. And I wondered, in relation to your presence here at UCA and the emergence of the centre, what would you like really in terms of your next steps to amplify that quiet voice somehow within our organisation? Because I feel that that voice will touch a lot of individuals from a lot of different life experiences, and it would be wonderful to know what your immediate sense of moving forward is. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Well, I think there's about three things jumped into my head as you were speaking. I think one is about connecting with the students at the university as well, because I'm particularly interested in hearing the voice of the student body and having students involved in what we're doing and sharing and their lived experience and their learned experience as well around this particular area. I think I have to do the rounds with, I think, with our staff as well, with our academics, and just keep banging on doors and saying, look, this is an area that is very important, we want to get you involved in. So there's the students, there's the staff, but also I think, I'm not going to lie to you, Catherine, I'm very passionate about this area. I want to get this out into the wider world and actually see UCA as becoming somewhere that people look to for pioneering this work. And I think that means taking it into other contexts, into other countries. You and I have talked about Northern Ireland and Palestine. And I think the next step alongside this communication back and forth to students and staff is to actually start getting the work into place. It's doing the work, bringing more partners on board, NGOs, other artistic organisations, policymakers as well. And so I think it's those three different areas all simultaneously that needs to be done.
I'm really inspired to hear that, and I think particularly in relation to, for example, the academic plan and what we're planning to develop around how we make sure our students feel like they belong in UCA. And in order to belong, you need to feel like your authenticity is going to be recognised.
Yeah.
Even if that's complicated or you can't articulate that particularly well. And I do feel what you have shown through this presentation is a way of accepting people, gently bringing them forward into the circle. And I'm just really looking forward to seeing how that develops in the organisation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Catherine. Any other questions?
Thank you, Catherine. Any other questions? You can put them in writing. You can raise. Anna Fox.
Hi, Simon. Thank you for a really fascinating presentation. I have one thing to ask, quite a simple thing, but I don't think you said this. Did art become interesting to you because of your research?
No, I'm a musician by heart. I'm one of those old school punk rock kids that discovered punk rock when I was about 15, living on a council estate in Barry, and it, for me, a little bit like I'm talking about here about that movement from proof, it changed my life. It's always been at the heart of what I do, and within that particular musical form, it's about self-determination. It's about those voices from outside of the centre being allowed a chance to be heard. And I think for me, that's why I ended up going to Colombia with some radical groups working in music and theatre. And then I suppose it was like, how can I, as Catherine said it quite much better than I did as well, much more articulately, about how can I amplify this, which is a rather apt choice of word for musician. So the theory, the theoretical, the sociology came afterwards, but there was a bit of a light bulb moment where it's, hang on a minute, we can bring these two areas together of understanding how art works on the individual and changes us. So it is that social psychology side of things, but also the uniqueness of art then to amplify my voice along with others and change the actual world that we're living in.
Right, and just for information, we have a graduate of MFA photography, Angela Zolago, who was the daughter of one of the judges supposedly killed by Escobar, and she's now teaching in a university which I can't remember the name of, and she made all her work around issues to do with her father. She's very interesting.
Oh, well, I'd like to, yeah, that would be good to touch base. Thanks, Anna. Somebody just threw up a question as well, asking me about the field work that I did in Colombia and Brazil particularly shape the theoretical model. It did. I was very lucky to interview some incredible, quite old at the time, thinkers within Brazil and Colombia. I got an incredible access because I was working at the British Council, in all honesty, that I would not have got if I'd been anywhere else. And these people had written the Constitution. They were the first culture ministers. And I think going to talk with them, doing the field work, started to shape the theoretical model that I developed, particularly in Brazil, I'll be honest. The theoretical models that people were already using in Brazil, the quite radical approach to culture and policies, particularly in the Lula administration of the early 2000s, were eye-opening. We were way behind in Europe in what we were actually thinking about how that worked. So it started to sharpen how I think, but then I took that model back and tested it again. So it was an iterative approach. But I remember quite clearly walking along a canal in North London with my partner, and just suddenly clicked as well when the penny dropped with how I could bring these different strands of understandings about power together. I hope that answers your question.
Lewis, there was one message from you. I'm guessing there is one prior to this, so we just saw one. Thank you. I guess Shana, this covers your point. Any other questions? Anna, do you want to come in again? Or this is a legacy hunt? Okay, we have Catherine. You want to come in?
I just wanted to pick up on Anna's question and comment, because I thought it was really, really pertinent, the order in which theory and kind of art or activism comes. And I believe real authenticity comes from experience, from being in community. You know, I think Simon has really articulated that so clearly. And wouldn't it be wonderful if our students, for example, were at a point where their stories, their sense of self, what they bring to the table, whether it's large, you know, big politics or small politics, if that was allowed to be articulated first, and I think it is within our community at UCA, but that they then find the theory they need to, if they wish to help them further understand what they're talking about, rather than, and I feel this quite passionately, and I think Simon's talk has really shown this, rather than seeking theory first and then looking to almost illustrate that theory. So I just wanted to say, Anna, you'd really kind of connected something in my mind when you raised your question. So thank you, and I think that shows we are a community. You know, our discussions are provoked by something like this presentation, but we just need to keep talking.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, definitely it's that the experience comes first. When I think about the whole area that I'm working in now, it's a series of accidents involving music, and particularly I was involved in the community arts organisation in Wales that was linked with one community arts organisation in Belfast, and I was a huge fan of a band called Stiff Little Fingers, which was very much about alter your native land, which is one of the song titles, and it was about how you could use music, art in a very powerful way. But it definitely, all of that came way before any of the actual theoretical modelling. And somebody also asked me, would I like to work anywhere else with this? I'm really interested. We're looking at the moment, Catherine and I, at Palestine, and we're looking at Ireland as well. But I think beyond that as well, I'm particularly interested in areas like I've worked a little bit in Myanmar, which I think is a fascinating area to look in, and in Bangladesh, but also China would be really interesting and challenging. But just to look at using this type of model, very political, obviously, But you know, I like that kind of challenge as well. Sorry, Anna, was there anything else?
Thank you. There is a question in the comments from Michael asking. He's wondering about how a sense of powerlessness against dominant hegemonies and resilience and energy to keep going when confronted with by cold-hearted power structures.
I think that's a brilliant question. I'll answer it with an example of somebody I know who does that. I worked quite a lot in Brazil with an organization called Agencia. It was set up by somebody from the periphery called Marcus Faustini. He was quite a radical, came from one of the favelas, and it was about using social entrepreneurship for young cultural artists. They gave them money and support. He continued it into the Bolsonaro area. People tried to keep beating him down. He took the idea over to the UK, and about 2 weeks ago, he received £1.2 million from the Council of England to run this across the whole of the UK. And you know, he kept on fighting against powers in different ways. He's still now fighting in Brazil, but he was also lucky enough to be appointed as the Secretary of State for Culture in Rio. And he just kept going. He just, even when he was up against people like Bolsonaro, he just kept on going and kept on working with young people particularly and bringing their voices to be amplified. And it's not, this is no short-term win, I think, Michael. This is a long-term piece of work that you have to do, and you have to persuade, change your ideas yourself sometimes as well, be prepared to be flexible. But also, I think for me, it's always around looking for those ideas around social justice and allowing those who don't have a chance to speak. And art can help do that.
Thank you. There is a hand from Michael, if you want to come in.
Hi, I thought I'd just come in with my voice. Thank you so much, Simon. Yeah, it's really interesting because I'm actually also a music person, and also sort of confronting an area of music making, which is the classical music field. And sort of, I suppose that what I'm aware of is sort of, for me, it's a very small area, but it's like a chink in a wall that I feel if you can sort of like take out one of those bricks, you know, the wall starts to crumble. And I suppose that there's different levels that people can work on in terms of engaging. But it sounds like the projects you've dealt with are quite vast, big projects. But I'm looking forward to hopefully meeting with you. And I think it sounds great that you have this research center setting up. So yeah, just want to sort of come in and say hello, really. But great.
Thank you. It doesn't always have to be big. There was plenty of projects I looked at. The one I mentioned in Cartagena with the dancers, 15 people, 2 guys, 15 people working in Cartagena in northern Colombia. They've been there for like 15 years from when the area was a really run-down slum, a bit of still are like that. And they work with their dedicated group in their small community. It doesn't have to be about size. It can be about how you connect with the people in your community. And I also noticed something pop up then from one of my old colleagues there. Hi, Louise, over in Sri Lanka. Yes, Sri Lanka would be an amazing place to look at as well. I think particularly in terms of the history of Sri Lanka. Yeah, let's have a conversation. I think that would be something really interesting to look at as well.
Thank you. If there is anyone want to come in? I have a question, maybe as an advice, you know, as UCA is becoming more international, as we saw, we did a presentation showing our research footprint around the world this couple of weeks ago. And I guess this coming 3-4 years will be really international working in UCA. Do you have any advice? You talked about a lot about decolonizing thought, about local knowledge. Our colleagues who are now trying to do international work, do you have any advice for them in terms of decolonize their knowledge?
Well, it's tricky, Hammer. I mean, I'm not, you know, I was at the British Council for about 10 years trying to build international relationships. I think if you can honestly go into these kind of relationships where you're talking about mutual benefit, for me, that is the key thing. The British Council used to call it mutuality, and sometimes, with the greatest respect to the British Council, whom I love dearly in lots of ways, it didn't always work in that way. And so for me, when we're talking about building a research centre, it's about being aware of those power structures, being aware not just around decolonizing, but around things around sexuality, around gender, is the areas that we've talked about as well, which are other forms of power and oppression, or can be. And I think it's always trying to look at being genuine as well. I think it's when my friend did a very classic piece of research on bullshit in academia, quote unquote. And I think it's about being honest with what you're bringing to the table in putting research together and involving our students, particularly because we do have such a diverse group of students, and learning from them. It's got to be about mutual benefit. And so we have to construct things around mutual benefit. And Catherine, so I just noticed Catherine's comment as well. It was very similar at the British Council, Catherine, when you yourself are based within one of the great, I'll use that in inverted commas, imperial nations, so to speak, as well. How do we deal with that legacy in terms of how we're moving forward, forming relationships with the rest of the world? And it's a huge challenge about how we do that. But we have to have the conversations. We have to be cognizant of that as well. And it's a massive challenge. I don't have all of these answers as well. Yeah, and you're right, the guilt is a very difficult one. Just very quickly, I'll tell a very brief story. I was in Myanmar. I was one of the first people to visit this particular area in Kachin province in Myanmar in 50 years when I went for the British Council in 2014. I thought I was going for one thing. When I arrived there, I thought I was meeting a small group of silk collective workers. It turned out to be the whole of 2 villages, about 400 people in a communal space. And I was invited onto a platform where I was asked to try and explain why the UK in 1947 had reneged under Churchill on the Pangyang Agreement of supporting what was then Burma in its independence. Not easy stuff.
Great, thank you very much. I think we are coming to the end of our 45 minutes. If there is any last comment from anyone, if there is any out of the cliff thought, we will close this session, and I will thank you again, Simon. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Anna, for your questions. Michael, everyone who wrote comments, and we will see you again in September with our new schedule for the next academic year. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Amber, as well. Bye.